Hi, I'm Jim Brayshaw, and today I'm going to talk about the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. This next one's a big one, and I don't have a high mountain here. I'm in Saskatchewan, sorry. All we have is 15-story buildings. But what happens next is we're told that the Diablos took him up to an exceedingly high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. Okay, I need to stop here because we have such an issue with taking things literally. First of all, is there any mountain high enough anywhere in the entire earth where you can see all the kingdoms of the world from one glance from the height of a mountain? Well, no, there isn't. But we choose not to take that literally when we use Christian theology to decide on our Satan. Yet we take the word Diablos as literally referring to a satanic entity. And the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, really managed a lot of it. They had a great influence over that system. So to take him up to a high place and say, look, all this could be yours. You could be part of this great empire, kingdom, and movement, religious movement that we lead. All you have to do is come join us, bow down and worship us. Not in the technical sense of bowing down to worship him as if he was their God, but in the sense of, you know what, join us, adhere to us, observe what we observe in the way we observe it, and therefore you'll become the ruler, just like us, of all that you can see. So taking Yeshua, Jesus, up to a high mountain and saying, you can have all these kingdoms of the world if you worship me, is something that can be done by a group of religious leaders who have power. Now, they took him to the pinnacle of the temple, which is a place they had access to as the religious rulers and leaders of the day. They then took him to this elevated point in Jerusalem and saying, look at this kingdom. And were they talking about the entire world as you see it, or were they talking about Jerusalem proper? How far could he have seen? What were the kingdoms that they were speaking of? Well, if we look at the context and the culture and the ideas that were going through the heads of some of those religious leaders, we find that they were referring to the Christ coming on board with their philosophies, ideas, and religious movement, and really becoming one of them, which is to say, bow down and worship me. And near the end of this passage, we have a concise statement by the Christ figure, really concludes for us who and what the Satan was. Was it a supernatural cosmic being, or was it a group of men that were dealing as the adversary? Well, we find in verse 10 of chapter 4, Christ, Yeshua, says to them, "Get behind me, Satan, for it's written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." So he turns on this group of adversaries, these Satans, these Diabloses, which, by the way, both words Satanas and Diablos both refer to an adversary, a group of people, or a human being being an adversary at times. So he turned on them and said, no, I am not going to join your club, and you guys need to know you're only supposed to worship the Lord your God. He chose to quote scripture to them, which was an excellent response to a group that's really poking and prodding him. And as I mentioned, they poked and prodded him with tests throughout the entire New Testament at least 9 times. So the statement we see at the end of this passage by the Christ is, "Get behind me, Satan." Now we see that exact phrase used when Christ is talking to Peter. Remember the passage where Peter says to Christ, hey, you're the Son of God, you're the Messiah, that's who people say you are, that's who I say you are. And then Christ says, I'm going to go die. And Peter says, no, let it not be so. And then what does Christ say after Peter says, no, don't go to your death? He says, Yeshua says, clearly turning to Peter, Peter, get behind me, Satan, he says to him. He calls Peter Satan. That's a pretty big deal, calling your best buddy Satan, unless your best buddy knows what a Satan is. And he did. And in fact, the Messiah, Christ, he actually referred to it and clearly defined it for us. He said, get behind me, Satan, to Peter, for you're not for the things of God, you're for the things of man. So a Satan in Christ's eyes was a man who was for the things of man. It was not a supernatural cosmic entity. So back to the passage. Again, he took him to an exceeding high mountain. He said, look at all the kingdoms of the world. You can have all these things if you do what? If you fall down and worship me. Well, that's a tough one. And it's a little known fact that if you or I saw a person come along today who claimed to be Messiah, we would want to apply tests to them to see if it is so that they're the Messiah. This is no more than a group of men doing their religious duty to test this guy, Jesus, Yeshua. and see if he was the Messiah as his claim. They tried to get him to turn stones to bread. That ought to prove he's the Messiah. That's what their book said. That's how to prove the guy's the Messiah. They tried to get him to leap from a high place. That ought to prove he's the Messiah if he lives, because that's one of their tests to prove he's the Messiah. They took him up to the top of a high place in the area and said, this could all be yours, buddy, because you are a good leader. And if you just come alongside us, bow down and worship us, is the way it's put in English, then you will have all this. So taking Yeshua, Jesus, up to a high mountain and saying, you can have all these kingdoms of the world if you work. So the statement we see at the end of this passage by the Christ is, get behind me, Satan. Now we see that exact phrase used when Christ is talking to Peter. Remember the passage where Peter says to Christ, hey, you're the Son of God, you're the Messiah, that's who people say you are, that's who I say you are. And then Christ says, I'm going to go die. And Peter says, no, let it not be so. And then what does Christ say after Peter says, no, don't go to your death? He says, and don't be afraid to pick up a copy of one of my books. You're going to find this entire story recounted, explained, and shown to be a story not about a supernatural Satan in my third volume, Who's the Devil? Jesus